Here are 10 pro sidechaining tips to help your kick and bass fit like a glove. Today I'm going to take you beyond basic volume ducking with tricks like Sidechain Stacking, advanced multiband, visual tools, and more. Stick around for the whole video because by the end you'll be able to combine all of these tricks to lock in your low end like a pro. And before we start, make sure you've watched my previous sidechaining video to get you up to speed with the basics. So let's start with sidechaining tip number 1. A crucial aspect to consider is the length of your kick drum. A basic kick is essentially a waveform sweeping down in pitch from high to low frequencies. The initial attack starts at a high frequency, quickly sweeping through the knock in the mid-range, and pitching down more gradually to the low frequencies. This tail is where the oomph and power lives. And this bassy tail can easily overlap and clash with your bassline, even when sidechaining. So getting the length of your kick's tail right is so important. Here's an example. Notice how long this kick drum's tail is. Even with the kick ducking the bass, you can see the kick's tail extends longer than my sidechain curve, so it's worth spending time getting your kick length right, either by trimming the audio or by using a plugin like Volume Shaper for precise trimming. But be careful, trim your kick too short and you'll remove too much oomph. I went more in depth on kick trimming in this video, so go and check that one out. And that leads perfectly into the next tip. To get the perfect kick length to match your sidechain, try tip number 2, the curve invert trick. Here's another kick and bass example. First, I'm going to load Volume Shaper on my kick channel. When I turn on audio mode, the LFO resets on each kick, and now I'll draw a curve that follows the kick's contour, shortening the tail. Once I'm happy with this trimming curve, I'll copy the plugin instance, and now I'll paste it over to the bass track. Another pro tip, you can also copy and paste curves between Shaperbox instances, but in this case, copying and pasting the plugin is faster. Now I'll route the kick channel into the bass plugin's sidechain input, and here in the bass channel's Volume Shaper, I'll select external sidechain. So now the kick channel is triggering this exact same trimming curve on the bass. Now for the secret sauce. I'll right-click on the editor to open this menu and flip the curve vertically. This inverts the kick's trimming curve into a bass sidechain curve. And because the bass sidechain curve is the exact inverse of the kick trimming curve, the ducking fits the kick perfectly. Now, in scenarios where you want total control over your kick and bass ducking, you can try tip number 3. This is what I call Sidechain Stacking. Here's a volume ducking curve on the bass, triggered by the kick. My first goal is to invisibly make space for the kick without hearing any pumping. So this tight curve is carving space for the kick's attack to punch through. And in this instance, I've set length to zoom in for more accuracy. Now I've minimized clashing, I can address the lack of groove. So now I'll use a second sidechain curve. This one's more zoomed out, with smoother, more relaxed settings. This adds subtle movement to the bass's sustain. You could try and draw this all in one complex curve, but by surgically ducking first and then gently pumping after, you've got more control over each stage. And I can adjust each curve's strength, shape and frequency ranges differently if needed. So just like how you might use little bits of gentle compression throughout a mix, don't be afraid to use multiple ducking techniques to reach your end goal. For tip number 4, here's something I don't really see discussed much, and that is, where should you place your sidechain plugin in the effects chain? Now, as with many music production questions, the short answer is, it depends, but here are some general guidelines. I usually put my sidechaining at the very end of the chain, so anything that changes or adds to the sound goes earlier, so distortion, filters, EQ, compression, etc., with sidechaining at the very end. This is because I'm generally not ducking to change the sound of the bass or how the other effects react to it, it's just for mixing and making space. However, maybe you're using something like a clipper or a limiter to give an invisible final ceiling to the bass track. In this case, I might put my clipper or limiter at the end after the sidechain plugin, especially with multiband ducking, because multiband processing after the clipper or limiter can undo that ceiling due to the subtle phase changes it causes. Then you've got reverb and delay. Where you place these depends on what you're going for. If, for example, you want to echo your pumped signal, leaving the echo unducked, place the echo at the end, after the sidechain. If you want the echo to pump along with the dry signal, place it before the sidechain plugin. And if you want your reverb or delay to pump a bit less drastically, use a rack or aux send and give the wet signal its own ducking. And like I said before, it depends, so feel free to try the opposite and experiment with Sidechain Order. Next, let's look at how to visualize your sidechaining with oscilloscopes and waveform tools. In both Kickstart and Volume Shaper, your bass waveform is shown on the oscilloscope. Route your kick into the sidechain input and the kick waveform is also overlaid. As I showed in my previous video, this is handy when drawing the perfect sidechain curve. You can also use a dedicated oscilloscope to see the final summed output waveform of your kick and bass together. You could group your kick and bass channels and load the oscilloscope on the group, or route them to a muted aux channel with the oscilloscope on it, or load the oscilloscope on your master, then solo your kick and bass channels. Another way to check visually is by soloing your kick and bass, then recording your master output to a new audio track. Now you can see how your kick and bass sum together and interact. If your goal is complete separation, doing this will help you see how your kick is punching through your bass. However, always trust your ears first and foremost. Use your ears and your eyes. Now, tip number 6, what if you want to keep your low end controlled and clean without any audible pumping? Multiband Sidechaining has entered the chat. Here's a drum loop and a long Reese style bass line. The low end of the kick isn't cutting through the bass enough, and the clashing is creating subtle distortion. So I've loaded Volume Shaper on the bass channel, with the drum loop routed into the sidechain input. And here in the audio trigger settings, I've set the input filter so that only the kick drum in the drum loop is triggering the bass ducking. Now the kick is short and deep, and the bass is sustained and has quite a bit of mids. So this full frequency ducking sounds too pumpy and obvious. You can hear the mids pumping. To solve this, we can head up to the band section. By dragging these handles here, I can add up to 3 bands of volume shaping, each with their own independent ducking curve. This works the same for all Shaperbox shapers, of course. So I'm going to set up my original band to restrict the ducking to only the low frequencies, and I'll leave the mids and the highs of the bass unducked. As I drag the band left, listen to how the bass pumping effect goes away. You're going to want to use good headphones or monitors to hear this. You can think of this as invisible sidechaining. We're getting the clean mixed benefits of ducking without the audible up and down movement. And FYI, you can also do this same technique with our Kickstart plugin. Turn on band, and the curve will only duck below the frequency value you set. Back to Volume Shaper, let's go even further with more multiband techniques for tip number 7. To help your bass wrap around your kick, try using 2 different ducking curves and strengths across 2 frequency bands. Note that you can copy and paste an LFO curve between bands, so you could have a smoother, more gradual curve ducking the lows, and a tighter curve for the mids and highs. Or let's say your bass is particularly full frequency, or maybe you've got different bass layers all grouped together. In this case, you can duck the lows, mids and highs inside one plugin, all with different curves and mix values. Short, tight ducking on the mid and high bands will push the bass out of the way of the kick's bright transient and mid-range knock, which only lasts a few milliseconds. And since a kick's bassy tail extends for longer, you can use longer ducking on the lows. I'd say this is more a technique for special occasions, not so much an everyday thing, but it does come in clutch when needed. Something I do more often is duck only specific frequencies. For example, here's a deep bass paired with a higher hitting kick. Ducking the entire bass when the kick hits sucks out all the sub energy from the bass. This is a common problem. If your kick's light and it doesn't have enough weight to fill the space made in the bass, you end up with an uneven low end. In this case, try this. For your kick, locate which frequencies contain the most energy. Then set up a band on the bass around those kick frequencies, and duck them. So here I'm ducking only where it's needed, without touching the bass's lowest sub-frequencies. For tip number 8, more multiband. You can adjust your crossover slope settings to tailor your band separation. As you've seen, this band section is where the signal is split into different frequency bands. You can manually set the slope of each filter's crossover point to 6, 12 or 24 dB per octave. To keep things simple, you'll generally be fine sticking to the default 6 dB per octave. In Volume Shaper, we chose this value as the default because it has the lowest impact on phase. In fact, at 6 dB per octave, the crossovers do nothing to the audio when the ducking is not happening. The sharper 12 dB and 24 dB crossovers will give you less overlap between bands for tighter separation. Even without any linear phase options, these are tight and transparent. Speaking of which, here at Cableguys we get asked this question quite often: why don't you add linear phase crossovers to Volume Shaper and Shaperbox? Well, linear phase crossovers would come with loads of latency, a greatly increased CPU hit, and most importantly, pre-ringing artifacts. This is not ideal for a sidechaining effect that gets used across many instances in a project. So our 6 dB crossovers are actually the best, most phase coherent compromise. Next, tip 9. Here's a technique for stealth sidechaining. I'm talking about Sidechained Dynamic EQ. This means EQing out specific frequencies from your bass only when the kick plays. So here, when the kick hits, the EQ dips down. Then when the kick is not playing, it rises back to unity. This technique doesn't give proper volume sidechaining or movement in the traditional sense, but it shines at subtle surgical applications. Then there's automatic, intelligent ducking. This EQ and other plugins can listen to the frequencies of your sidechain signal and duck those same frequencies out of your source sound. Personally, I find these great for subtle use cases to carve space for vocals and synths in the mid-range. But when pushed hard, especially on bass, this spectral processing can sound a bit computery and unnatural to my ears. But again, don't take my word for it, try all the various options for yourself. Now for tip 10, this sidechain trick is flavour of the month for crunchy electronic music. I'm talking about ring mod sidechaining. Say you've got your kick and snare, and everything else you want to sidechain in a group. The trick is to use a rectified, inverted version of your kick and snare as a trigger, and route that into a ring modulator placed on your sidechain group. So the ring modulator uses the kick and snare signal to downwardly modulate the amplitude of the other sounds at the waveform level. Virtual Right goes into more detail in his video called How I Sidechain, along with some Volume Shaper tips. I suggest you watch that video for more info. So by mixing and matching all these tips in your tracks, your sidechain game will reach a whole new level. Let me know your favourite ways to sidechain in the comments, and check out Shaperbox and Kickstart at cableguys.com.